Months ago, debate raged about hydroxychloroquine and whether or not it is an effective treatment for COVID. As time moved us away from that debate, the focus has been on the approval of emergency authorizations for the COVID vaccines developed by Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. A strange silence remains on an existing cheap drug, Ivamekton. Dr. Pierre Kory made an impassioned plea before the US Senate in December last year, stating the outcomes of findings relating to studies on Ivermectin and its effectiveness. Qualifying the results is renowned leading research medical scientist and consultant to the WHO, Dr. Tess Lawrie, who is joining the Informer right now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Lawrie, you are not someone that is sort of front and center in front of the cameras, and you don't really even have a social media presence, but you have come forward in a massive way since working on this study with Dr. Kory and the team that pulled this research together. What is it about this that has made you come in front of the cameras and speak to whoever essentially will listen?
Well, Natalie, just to correct you, I'm not working, I wasn't working with Dr. Kory on Ivermectin. I read his review and I saw that there were some limitations in that he hadn't done meta-analyses of all the outcomes and of the trials. And so I went ahead and did those further analyses. This was in my initial report. I subsequently have I've superseded that report by teaming up with some very experienced systematic reviewers, and we started from scratch, doing a full literature search and so on, identifying all the relevant studies, randomized controlled trials on Ivermectin, and there are numerous, and pooling those data to produce an effect estimate, which suggests that Ivermectin significantly or can have a significant impact on COVID, particularly with regard to reducing deaths. So deaths and obviously improving outcomes for people.
Now, before we get into all the results that you found and certainly things that I have heard Dr. Kory stating in interviews, just for those that don't know, what is meta-analysis?
Okay. So meta-analysis is a way of taking individual studies, data, and pooling them to estimate an effect of a medicine. So if you consider on any treatment, there's always many individual studies that are done in different parts of the world and maybe slightly different populations, slightly different doses might be used and so on. So a doctor reading a journal on reading a particular article on a treatment can't really make a decision on whether the treatment works or not, because one study findings might differ substantially from another study findings, which can only be, the reasons for these can only be identified, when you look more closely at each study and also assess their risks of bias and so on. So any clinical practice guideline is usually based on systematic review evidence and meta-analysis. And it's this pooled data, which is considered to be the best, the highest quality evidence that to be used to support, the treatments your doctors give you.
And as I mentioned in the intro, you actually have your own company, but you do work for the WHO.
Yes, so I have an independent medical research company. I'm kind of an independent academic. I'm not in a university, and I hire my services to various nonprofit organizations and research units.
And have you worked with Dr. Kory before, or any of the team at the FLCCC, which is the Frontline COVID Critical Care Alliance?
Yes. No, I've never worked with them before, but obviously we have had a lot of correspondence since my work.
Of course.
Yeah.
And so did you start that meta-analysis prior to speaking to him, or did you read the research and then reach out and say, this is what you're missing and I would like to do it for you?
Well, yeah, so I did reach out to him, and that's exactly what I said. And he said, well, don't bother because he thinks WHO is busy doing something anyway. But because I know, how slow sometimes these organizations can be, I thought, well, let me just do it anyway, because it was between Christmas and New Year, and I know everyone takes a holiday at that time. So I just thought, I'm just going to do this and see what I think, because it might be important.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so after completing the analysis of these studies, and you've, as you've stated already, you've essentially done it twice. Is there any doubt in your mind about the findings on ivermectin?
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind, because what you have to understand is that just focusing on randomized controlled trials as well, and even on the meta-analysis, is just one piece of the puzzle. When you look at the whole picture, so you've got this evidence from the individual randomized controlled trials pooled into the meta-analysis, and then you've also got country case studies, because many countries have already started using ivermectin, and there are these graphs that showing these dramatic effects once ivermectin is introduced, which obviously might be due to other reasons, perhaps good masking and social distancing and so on. But usually these graphs are associated with, you can see, because they track the Google mobility as well, and you'll see that it's not because of lockdowns. Although, there's plenty of country case studies, and then there's also lots of observational data, doctors in nursing homes saying, well, I've used it for scabies amongst my elderly nursing home residents, and none of them got COVID compared to the next door nursing home that, everyone got, and so on. So there's this richness in the data, and certainly the big picture is quite astounding.
And just in regard to the analysis that you did, so you use the same techniques in regards to the study that you completed that you would do if you were working on a study for the WHO?
Yes. So in actual fact, in the decision-making process, you don't just look at the effect of a medicine or intervention. You always, when evaluating whether or not to recommend a treatment or not, you also look at how much it costs, whether it's cost effective. You look at whether it's acceptable to people, whether people value the outcomes associated with it, whether it's feasible to implement, and importantly, whether it's fair, whether it improves health equality. Because there are many treatments that don't, because sometimes it's related to cost, they're so expensive. But with regard to ivermectin, it seems to be, a wonderfully fair intervention, because it's widely available, and it's especially in low and middle income countries and the most disadvantaged populations, and also for vulnerable populations like the elderly. And also for because at the moment we have this unfair distribution of exposure. We've got all these frontline workers unfairly exposed to COVID-19 without protection, and so ivermectin can fill that gap and make it more equal, so that if they were to be receiving ivermectin as prophylaxis, they would have a reduced risk of getting COVID infection.
Now, when the debate around hydroxychloroquine was going on, and if it's still going on, I'm not hearing certainly as much about it, but one of the arguments was that despite its 70-year history and track record of safety record, and it being suitable for pregnant women, nursing mothers and children, safety came back as one of the issues that was a problem. Are there any safety concerns with ivermectin?
Well, ivermectin's been around for 40 years. It's been given to about a third of the world's population, and I think about 3 to 4 billion doses have been used. And in all of that dosing, there are only 4,000 and something adverse event registered on the pharmacovigilance database of the WHO and Uppsala University, and 16 deaths. So, so it's quite remarkable when you then compare it, for example, not compare, but if you consider that something like remdesivir has only been around a year, and it's been associated with more adverse events registered on the database and 400 and something deaths. So, I think I'm just using that to illustrate that it's an extremely safe medicine. And in fact, Merck did a randomized controlled trial in 2002, or the late 90s, and published in 2002. And they used doses up to 10 times the normal dose. And found it to be extremely safe. So, and that's a published report which anyone can access.
And now in the study, you've talked about ivermectin working prophylactically, but it also works in all cases of COVID, mild, moderate, and severe. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. And this is because ivermectin has many mechanisms of action. It has antiviral properties, and it also has anti-inflammatory properties. So the antiviral properties work really well early on in the disease and in prevention. The anti-inflammatory properties work, with a more severe disease. When the inflammatory response, a little bit later on, when the inflammatory response has kicked in and is causing a lot of destruction. So
it's inflammation that's causing people to become so severely sick with it, or that's happening as a result of them being so sick?
It comes as a result of the viral infection, the viral load. So I'm not an expert on this, but there are a number of papers showing that there's these different phases of the disease, and the beginning of the disease is more to do with the viral load, and then the latter part is more to do with the damage that the trouble people have with breathing that lands them in hospital is to do with more the inflammation.
And I saw you speak in another interview where you actually said that this whole research has opened a whole lot of doors in regards to what ivermectin might actually be able to treat in regards to other viruses and illnesses that are going on. So what sort of other illnesses do you think you could treat?
Well, I think what would be very interesting to do more research on is to look at all these viral conditions that we don't have treatments for, and because we don't actually have a cheap broad spectrum antiviral, and it looks like ivermectin might be certainly is the drug to look at in a range of viral infections now, and to see if it can have benefit.
Now, Dr. Corey has talked about how doctors and everybody sort of looking into ivermectin has been able to replicate the same results. And he actually said that these sort of results haven't been replicated in some time, and he imagines the last time that patterns like this were emerging would have been around the time that penicillin was first discovered. Is that a statement you would agree with?
Yeah, well, there certainly is a suggestion that this, that this could be quite a dramatic find. But you must remember that, so whilst there is a consistency across the studies, there have been some negative studies. For example, just last week, there was a study published in JAMA, and it had, well, it wasn't necessarily negative, but it didn't have a significant, show a significant difference with ivermectin versus placebo. And funny enough, this study hit the newspapers and actually managed to get published, whereas a whole lot of positive studies sit on preprint servers and just don't seem to get published, and certainly doesn't hit the news. So it's really a strange situation at the moment, where we have so much good evidence on ivermectin, including all these reviews, and yet it's very difficult to communicate the message.
you've brought this up at the perfect time, because I wanted to bring up Dr. Corey's address in front of the US Senate on December 8th. That original video of his address was put online by a major news network here in the US, but after it went viral very, very quickly, the video was taken down, and my understanding is it's actually not available on any of the social media channels anymore, and to find it you have to go to the FLCCC website. And you have talked, you released an address to Boris Johnson on January 6th, talking about ivermectin and the need to certainly look at it and pay attention to this drug. And your video was taken down, but eventually reinstated. Are you finding the censorship around this topic quite bizarre? I don't know what other word.
Actually, I would actually just like to extend that a little bit, because most recently, Dr. Corey's paper, which had been initially accepted, copy edited, proofread, peer reviewed, and so on, was rejected at the last minute from Frontiers of Pharmacology. And this seems to be a pattern at the moment with regard to work on ivermectin. And it would appear by the response that he's been penalized in some way for his efforts to passionately communicate this. Now, I don't know. As a doctor, I think it's very difficult to be dispassionate when you are aware of a life-saving treatment that is being, or that you perceive to be being blocked from people receiving. And I would just like to explain that after the Ebola crisis, Ebola emergency in 2015, the WHO came out with it met with a whole lot of leading stakeholders, including journals, and they drew up some guidelines on research and emergencies. And I'd like to just read a couple of the statements to you, if you don't mind.
Please.
So they say, so this is developing global norms for sharing data and results during public health emergencies. And they say research is essential in the context of public health emergencies. The primary purpose of such research is to advance public health, prevent illness, and save lives. Researchers should always weigh the public health consequences of their actions in withholding and sharing results. Every researcher that engages in generation of information related to a public health emergency has a fundamental moral obligation to share preliminary results once they're adequately quality controlled for release. The onus is on the researcher and the funder supporting the work to disseminate information through pre-publication mechanisms. So this is why there are a number of pre-publication websites now where researchers can put their work before submitting to, or at the same time that they submit to a journal. So it goes on to say that public health emergencies of global significance constitute compelling examples of the importance of sharing data. Journals should not hinder the sharing of data that could help mitigate the impact of such emergencies, and should encourage or mandate public sharing of relevant data. And finally, it says journals should not penalize authors who, prior to manuscript submission, share data in the interest of resolving an urgent situation, for example, with public health authorities, or more broadly when warranted. So it just seems like all of that has been forgotten in the context of this pandemic. And the urgency, I mean, I can just share with you as well, I've reached out to, since the video, I've reached out to all the regulatory bodies in the UK. I've reached out to people on the Science and Technologies Committee who are meeting today. They all have received a very comprehensive document on the benefits and safety of ivermectin, as well as all the other considerations we've discussed with equity and feasibility resources and so on. I haven't received, I've received one response yesterday after all this time. but I haven't received an acknowledgement from any of the people, who are actually meeting at the site. They have a science meeting today on COVID, and you'd think there would be some curiosity or interest just to say, Dr. Lawrie, why don't you just come along and show us this evidence of yours, or what, or something, and it's not just mine. It represents the work of some very experienced reviewers. So
one of my observations, just being someone watching this whole thing unfold, when there's one study, I understand hesitance towards, the latest drug that somebody's saying this is the thing, and if you've only got one study behind you. But when you have umpteen studies, and Dr. Corey's initial sort of study, I believe, was based on 27 different studies, that's a considerable body of work that I would think that the people that are locking us down and asking us to socially distance and not go and visit our grandparents who are in the nursing homes, you would think that they would want to end this as soon as possible. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that that's not what they're trying to do, but to me, they should be exploring every single avenue, even if it means they hit a dead end. Then they know that's not an option, and we move on. That's the part that seems a little scary to me.
I would agree. I mean, there's a mismatch and a sort of double standard between, what seems to be considered the ideal type of research is research that's funded by a pharmaceutical company. And then as soon as they have some inkling that it might be beneficial, it's published in the newspaper, and then suddenly it's okay to be used or given, used off license, with little concern for long-term safety or anything like that. So here we're sitting with a medicine that's been around for ages, is extremely safe. There's a huge body of mountain of evidence on it. And there's just this kind of absolute blindness to putting it as a number one priority for discussion and public discussion too.
And talking about Dr. Corey's passion when he spoke in front of the US Senate, he actually works in the intensive care units. Is that correct?
Yes. So he sees people dying every day.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I thought I had heard him say in some of his interviews. He said, I am in there and I'm watching this happen, and I know what can help them, and nobody's listening. I imagine if that was me, I would be.
The politicians don't take a Hippocratic oath. It's really a remarkable situation that doctors find themselves now, where they're unable to treat patients with life-saving medicine and have to wait for the politicians to look at the evidence. And in actual fact, I received my first response today, as mentioned, and it literally just says there's no. It's unsigned, it's just sort of by the government department, and it just says, dear Dr. Lawrie, we're waiting for high quality evidence, basically. So it's remarkable, as I say, this huge double standard in any event, because none of the interventions that are currently being used are based on high quality evidence. And yet they're insisting that, firstly, they're judging that there isn't high quality evidence when I've just sent them a document detailing the route to making a recommendation on Ivamekton. But also, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was going to say, is it strange that they only want evidence, or seem to want evidence, from the manufacturers of the drugs? I would have thought that independent research by people that have no skin in the game would have been a better option.
You think so, but
bias.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, because it does seem like medical research has been hijacked by pharmaceutical industry, and it's almost as if unless you have a load of money, a very expensive trial with the clinical trial monitors and whatever, and the pharmaceutical company holds the data, somehow it's considered not good enough. Now, the research that's been done on Ivamekton comes from doctor-led studies. So these studies are from low and middle income countries mainly, and they are studies that have been conducted by concerned doctors who are at the coalface and they see something's working and they want to test it. And they've done these studies, some of them are small, but when you pool all this data, you can see the big picture.
And what has been the reaction to this research from other doctors?
It was quite interesting because we held this meeting called the British Ivermectin Recommendation Development Meeting just over a week ago, or 2 weeks now. Many of the doctors who attended were GPs who had never even, in the UK, who had never even heard of ivermectin. And there was considerable enthusiasm when presented with the evidence and the discussion and the cheapness and the safety and the history of ivermectin, towards saying, well, just why aren't we using this now? And I suppose they must be very surprised that they have learned so little of it. There've literally been hundreds of studies published on ivermectin over the last year, and they just haven't reached the newspapers at all. One wonders how this can happen.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there are some countries which are using ivermectin, and the results seem to be quite startling in how quickly there is a decline in cases and deaths. So Peru, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Central and South America have all been using.
I mean, if you take a look at Uttar Pradesh in India, okay, they've been using it since August. Now they have much lower deaths. They have a massive population. It's like 200 million people, so that's 5 times the UK population, I'm guessing, and yet they have substantially more deaths. I think the UK has 20 times the number of deaths they have every day. So I think it's just worth saying, to the politicians and the scientists who are informing them, is it not worth just taking a look at this and see what other countries are doing?
Do you think, because the reality is the first world countries, the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, are all seemingly turning a blind eye to this drug, will there come a point where they're unable to deny the efficacy?
I can't really say. I'm beginning to think that there's no amount of evidence that's ever going to be sufficient. And there is something called, I think, like a Semmelweis reflex, where people get so stuck on a certain narrative or belief that they are unable to see the truth, no matter how much evidence you present them with. So it seems in this case they're not even able to open the document to look at it and assess it. So I'm not sure. I really don't know where we're going with this.
So in Australia, they have the COVID-19 task force, and that task force is advising the TGA, which is the Therapeutic Goods Association, on what they should be doing in terms of treatments and prevention for COVID. This task force is set up to give them the latest information. The information is updated weekly. But when I had a look just before we started filming, they are stating that there are only 7 randomized trials that include 518 adults in relation to ivermectin. Now, we already know that there are 27 studies just for Dr. Corey's research. And I say Dr. Corey, but the whole FLCCC group. How many people do you recall were included in those studies, sort of across those 27?
We have almost 2,000 in the deaths analysis now, and altogether we're probably looking at around 3,000 from randomized controlled trials. There are thousands of other people who have been involved in ivermectin studies, there's some countries, for example, if Professor Covert in Argentina, I don't think he will do any more randomized controlled trials because he does not think it's ethical. those doctors know it's worked. Dr. Covert has published written about 10 papers on ivermectin, trying to draw the attention of the Western countries to it. And I think many of these doctors and researchers in those countries are just giving up and probably just going to say, okay, we'll just leave you guys to it. You don't seem to be able to hear anything. But unfortunately, it's the public in those countries who are losing out big time.
So you talked about there being at least one other study and one which wasn't favourable necessarily to ivermectin, not necessarily bad findings, but sort of not as favourable. But have there been more? Sorry?
You would expect a range. You don't expect a range of findings, and that was in mild disease, so you're unlikely to necessarily see dramatic results.
But have there been, would you hazard a guess as to how many more studies have come out sort of since, say, the beginning of the year? Are we talking tens or?
Probably, let me think. There's probably been at least 8 published either on preprint servers. As I say, there's a difficulty in getting the work published, but so probably at least 8 since RCTs since my first report, and there are about 40 on the clinical trial registries. There there's a significant amount of research being done in this. The question is, and in actual fact, for example, an organization like the World Health Organization is in a position to actually call in all those data, and that was in one of it was one of the points in that document that they issued in 2015, and they are in a position to say, can everybody in the world who's conducting a randomized controlled trial on ivermectin now please give us your data, and they could do that and obtain and update their evidence very, very quickly and reassure everybody that they're looking into it,
And do you know, are they looking into it, or are they looking at the study that you've worked on, or?
They are looking into it, and they appointed a doctor to do a systematic review, Andrew Hill, and so he did publish a review on a preprint website in the middle of January, and I understand they must be looking at it now. I certainly have no. It's not the department I usually work with, so but I have sent them the findings of the meeting we had where with 60, I think with 65 or so stakeholders at the meeting, including numerous experts from around the world on ivermectin for COVID. And so we have submitted that to them, and I have received a reply to say they've received it. I'm just hoping that they will approve ivermectin as soon as possible.
Now, I just want to finish up with something in regard to Australia. We, in Australia, they have done really, really well with their numbers. We did have about 800 deaths in Victoria in the aged care facilities. But they've also been very reactive if there are cases specifically in Victoria where there have been sort of snap lockdowns. There was one about a month ago. And to know that winter is coming up, COVID looks to be a cyclical type of virus, kind of like the flu. So knowing that winter is coming, it's quite possible that there may be a resurgence. Is there anything you would say to Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, in regard to ivermectin?
Well, I would just say, it's a no-brainer, really. You should just approve it today, like many governments have already around the world.
Dr. Tess Lawrie, thank you so much for joining us at The Informer. There's a lot to unpack on this topic, but thank you for taking me through it step by step.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.